Good evening. It's 8 o'clock in Yerushalayim, and it's time to begin our regular Halacha Shir. This is WebYeshiva.org, and our topic is astrology. What we've seen up till this point are a ton of sources on the side of those great rabbis who embraced astrology. They had different methods, different astrological methods, but they embraced the underlying idea. And we had, on the other hand, tons of sources of those following the Rambam who completely reject the possibility of any astrology being correct, and therefore demand that any Talmudic passages which seem to imply that the rabbis themselves were astrologers must be reinterpreted in some metaphorical way. Then we saw the position of the Meiri, who took a middle road, a middle path on the issue, holding that much of astrology is rooted in prohibited and silly magic, prohibited and silly idolatry, but some of astrology is rooted in the facts of nature, the way the world is created. Everyone knows that when the sun is high in the sky, noontime, you don't want to engage in hard physical work. During the summer, everyone knows that there's an influence of the sun upon the earth, and over noontime in the summer, you're going to avoid heavy physical work outside in the sun. Everyone knows that. It's a simple fact of nature. So the Meiri took this middle view. Now what we're doing is looking at the interpretation of different Talmudic, Rabbinic sources from the 2 points of view. Last time we began looking at the Mishnah. Let's see if I can get the Mishnah on the screen correctly. I hope this is going to do it. Let's see. Yeah, now I'm going to fit the text to the screen and make it look nice for everyone. There we go. We began to look at this Mishnah last time, but let's review quickly the few lines that we already looked at, and then we'll get into new material. So the text is from the Mishnah, from Tractate of Avodah Zarah. The very fact that I've extracted this Mishnah from Tractate of Avodah Zarah, the Tractate of Idolatry, is a little bit ominous that astrology is being discussed by the Mishnah in the context of astrology, a little bit ominous right there. But what we saw last time was that the non-Jewish scholars of Rome asked the rabbis back in the days of the Mishnah, if HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't like Avodah Zarah, why doesn't he destroy all of the idols? The answer was, we saw last time, that just because the foolish idolaters worship the sun and the stars doesn't mean that God can destroy them. They're needed. The sun and the stars are needed for the existence of the earth, and God is not going to destroy the earth just because some foolish idolaters decide to worship the sun and the stars. Then the non-Jews of Rome asked the rabbis, well, not all of the idolaters are worshiping the sun and the stars. Some of them are worshiping specific statues, specific idols, plastic images which have been made. Why doesn't God just create? Why doesn't God just destroy the plastic images? Why doesn't God just destroy the idols that the people are bowing down to, venerating, praying to, and bringing sacrifices to? Well, why doesn't God just destroy the idols if God is so unhappy with them? To which the rabbis responded, if God would destroy the idols and leave the other objects of idolatry, the sun, the moon, and the stars in the sky, that would only strengthen the belief in the idolatry of the sun and the stars. That would only strengthen the idolatry of worshiping and venerating the celestial bodies, and therefore God is surely not going to do that. That's the Mishnah which we saw last time. Now let's pick up with new material. Rambam, Maimonides, in his commentary on that Mishnah, Rambam wrote his commentary on the Mishnah when he was a young man. He was just starting out in his rabbinic career, and he was fleeing. He fled from Spain. There was anti-Jewish persecution in Spain in the days of Rambam, and he, together with many other, 12th century, Rambam, together with many other Jews, fled Spain because of this. And while he was fleeing Spain en route to safe haven, he eventually ended up in Egypt, which was a much safer place for the Jews in those days. While he was en route, fleeing from Spain to Egypt, en route, he wrote this commentary on the Mishnah that we are about to quote from. Back in those days, he was just beginning, he was a young man just beginning his rabbinic career. I say rabbinic career, that's not a very good, not a very precise term. Rambam never actually functioned as the rabbi of a community. He was never the rabbi of a synagogue. He was never the rabbi of a town. The reason, the Rambam explains himself, that the reason he never accepted a position as official rabbi of a community, of a synagogue, anything like this, the reason he never accepted, although he's offered such positions, the reason he never accepted them was because of his deep-seated belief that it is prohibited to use Torah as a means of earning one's livelihood, and therefore, since it is prohibited to use Torah as a means of earning one's livelihood, one cannot be paid, one cannot accept any money for any Torah activity. And therefore, although he devoted most of his life to Torah and halacha, disseminating Torah, teaching Torah, resolving Torah questions which came up, how did he publish his books? Back in those days, all you had to do was write your own personal copy of the book, and anyone else who was interested had the job of copying it himself or hiring a scribe to copy it. Back in those days, publishing cost exactly nothing. He held that it's simply prohibited to accept money for rabbinical positions. He's not the only one who held that, and therefore he always found some other means of livelihood, a secular means of livelihood, at which he would work a few hours a day in order to support himself and his family, and the bulk of his time he would devote to Torah. He began in the pearl business together with his brother. The Rambam had a brother, and the two of them worked together in the pearl business, importing pearls from India to North Africa, from India to Egypt. Unfortunately, at one point during this pearl business, unfortunately, the ship on which the Rambam's brother was returning from India to Egypt with a shipment of pearls to be marketed, the ship sank. Everyone died, and the shipment was lost, and that put the Rambam out of the pearl business. He lost his merchandise. There was no insurance back in those days, and he was simply out of the pearl business. And he lost his brother as well. And his brother died in the sinking of the ship. He had to find another means of livelihood, having this incredible mind, where he had to only read a book once very quickly, just thumb through the pages, and then he had it all in his head in perfect memory, having one of these astounding memories. The Rambam had read every medical text available in Egypt in those days. Remember, Egypt in those days was the center of world culture. There were more books available in Egypt in those days than anywhere else in the world. It was the center of world culture. Well, at least in this part of the world. I don't know what was going on in the Far East or in other places. He knew everything ever written about medicine, and he decided to become a physician. He became the physician in the court of the Sultan in Egypt, He became the court physician, worked at that job a few hours a day, making livelihood for himself and his family, and the bulk of his day he devoted to learning, teaching, and writing his great works. At one point, this is in the 12th century, during the time of the Crusades. Richard, the King of England in those days, was on the Crusades in the Holy Land, and the reputation of the Rambam was such that King Richard of the Lion's Heart, the English king in the Holy Land during the Crusades, heard of the reputation of the Rambam and wanted to hire him to come to London, to come to Westminster to be the court physician in England. Rambam declined that offer, saying, "Why on earth would I want to leave civilized, cultured Egypt and go to the land of the barbarians in the north and live in England?" He decided to stay in Egypt, where he was quite prosperous. Let's see what he had to say about our issue. Now remember, since he wrote this commentary on the Mishnah when he was still a young man, not yet internationally famous, not yet famous at all, outside a small circle of scholars who knew of him. Since he was not very well known, surely not internationally well known in his youth, he wrote his commentary on the Mishnah in Arabic because it was intended for the small circle of scholars who knew him, and they were all speakers of Arabic, of course, in North Africa. Later in his life, when he had acquired an international reputation, and there was great thirst for his books in France, in other places in Europe where the rabbis did not know Arabic, later in his life, when he had an international reputation, he then switched to writing his books in Hebrew so that they would be equally available to rabbinic scholars in North Africa and in Europe. This is a very important historical points to remember. If you encounter a tshuva or a letter written by the Rambam, and you have to figure out whether the letter was written early in his career or late in his career. In general, the tshuvot and letters which the Rambam wrote in Arabic were in general written early in his career. Late in his career, he would write letters or tshuvot in Arabic only if he was writing to someone who did not know Hebrew very well and needed an Arabic language response. Letters or tshuvot that he wrote in Hebrew, on the other hand, were surely written late in his career when he had already acquired an international reputation and corresponded with rabbis in France, Germany, and Europe, and obviously that correspondence had to take place in Hebrew, not in Arabic. Let's see what he said. This is a Hebrew translation of the original Arabic. I hope you like the translation. If not, you can complain about it. Rov b'nei Adam, the majority of people, niftim bazeh pitui gadol. The majority of people are hugely deceived. The majority of people are led astray and fooled. Choshvim, they think, sheyesh lahem inyanim amitiyim. The majority of people have been fooled, have the wool pulled over their eyes. They think that there is some substance, some reality, some truth lying at the foundation of astrology. Ein hadavar kein. That's simply not correct. That's wrong. Ad ki hatovim hasidim mibnei datenu. Things have gotten so bad that even our greatest Hasidim, the greatest pious Jews of our datenu, our religion, our greatest co-religionists, our greatest fellow Jews, who are very pious and leading rabbis, choshvim, they too think. They too think that astrology has truth in it. The rabbis, The rabbis know that, of course, we are prohibited from using astrology, but they still think that it works, that it's true, and the Torah prohibited us from using it, rather like pork. It really is food. It really is nutritious. It really works if you swallow it and eat it. Cook it first, I suppose. Cook it, swallow it. It really works, but the Torah prohibits us from eating pork. Many of the great rabbis think that astrology works a similar way. It's true. It really works, just the Torah prohibited us from it. Mitzvah Torah Bavad. It's only a Torah prohibition, which therefore applies to us and not to the non-Jews. Our commandments, our mitzvot apply to us, and we have no particular interest in preventing non-Jews from eating pork. They're welcome to eat all the pork they want. It's only we who are prohibited from eating pork. It's only we who are prohibited from practicing astrology, just as we have not the slightest objection to non-Jews eating pork. They don't have these mitzvahs. Similarly, we have not the slightest objection to them practicing astrology if astrology would be fraudulent and a lie and false. Well, there's something inherently wrong with that, if that were true. But the great rabbis think there's nothing inherently wrong with astrology. It's true. There's nothing fraudulent about it, nothing deceptive about it, and therefore, for non-Jews, it's fine. Let them do it. Einam Yodim. But there are these rabbis who think falsely, incorrectly, that there's some validity to astrology. And Devarim B'Teilim L'Kozim, they don't know. These rabbis don't know that astrology is totally and completely false. It is a fabrication, a tissue of lies. There is no real basis to it at all. It's all shadow and fiction. Torah prohibits us from everything which is a lie. Torah prohibits us from everything which is a fraud. Torah prohibits us from everything which is deceptive. And that's, among other things, astrology. And that, incidentally, applies not only to us, but to all the nations of the world. After all, the commandments of the Torah, which are of a ritual nature. You have to keep Shabbos, you're not allowed to eat pork. All the commandments of the Torah, which are of a ritual nature, apply only to the Jewish people and not to the nations of the world. But those commandments of the Torah, which are rooted in fundamental reason, even if the Torah had never prohibited fraud, we would know, any rational person knows that fraud is, of course, wrong. It's fundamentally immoral. Even if the Torah had never prohibited murder, any rational person knows that it's fundamentally wrong to murder, fundamentally immoral to murder. Those commandments, which represent fundamental morality, which anyone should be able to figure out by himself. Any rational person should be able to figure out by himself that these things are wrong. Well, these commandments apply equally to Jews and to non-Jews. Another way of saying exactly the same point is that those commandments, which are dictated not only by God, but also by human reason, any commandment which is dictated by human reason demands that the commandment be so, that there be no murder, that there be no deception, that there be no fraud, that there be no lying. Any commandment which is dictated by human reason applies equally to Jews and non-Jews. Non-Jews are equally bound by the dictates of human reason. That's why God created the human mind, that we should know how to live in this world. We Jews have special commandments above and beyond all that, but as far as non-Jews are concerned, they're surely not allowed to engage in fraud, deception, trickery, and lies, and that's what astrology is. It has no basis in reality at all. That's the Rambam's position. Well, we already knew that the Rambam was the leader of the anti-astrology camp. This is something we already knew because we've seen texts from the Rambam before. Let's see how other rabbis counter this argument. Let's see what other rabbis do to deal with this argument. The text we have on the screen now is from the Nimukei Yosef. Nimukei Yosef is medieval Spain, one of the great Sephardic authorities, and he was particularly influential in halachic terms, not well known at all, well, justifiably not very well known at all as a commentator on the Torah, didn't have much to say, surely nothing of great significance as far as commentaries on the Torah are concerned, but as far as halacha is concerned, Jewish law, he was one of the heavyweights in medieval Spain. Let's see what he says. Masha Adam Makir, v'Marechet Kochavim U'Mahalachan, what mankind perceives, the things that man perceives in the celestial sphere, when we look up into the nighttime sky and we see the movement of the celestial bodies, there are certain things you can see during the day too, but usually things are visible, most things are visible only at night. But what we see regarding the movement of the celestial bodies, the stars, which, as we know in rabbinic terminology, includes what we call the planets. What we call planets are also called stars in rabbinic terminology. Kagon, Elu Hovre Shamayim Achozim B'Kochavim, people who study the movements of celestial bodies, like the astrologers, who look at the stars, who gaze at the stars in order to figure out what's going to happen. Ein ze bichlal nachash. This is not included in the category of prohibited magic. The Torah doesn't like magic at all, but looking at the movement of the celestial bodies, the stars and the planets, in order to figure out what the future will bring, that's nothing magical about that. Shezo chochma gedola. It's a great science. Gezerah shegaza kodesh baruch hu m'sheshes yimei bereishis. And just like God imprinted the laws of nature in this world. You study Newtonian mechanics, you study elementary physics, and you learn the laws of nature, which HaKadosh Baruch Hu implanted into this world, F equals MA. Just like those are physical laws that God put into the workings of the universe, so the principles of astrology were built into the natural working of the universe. It's teva, it's a fact of nature that the stars influence events down here on earth. Lahanhig olamo b'chach, that's the way God runs the world. God runs the world with the rules of chemistry. He runs the rules with the words. He runs the world with the rules of physics, and God runs the world with the rules of astrology. That's how it works. Okay, therefore, yitpalel kol chasid. Therefore, anyone who is truly pious, any Jew who is truly religious, will pray, levatel mimenu, will pray to God that God will cancel gezerat hamazal. God should cancel the decree of whatever constellation you were born under. Ki me'eta don hakolba, because everything that happens because God wants it to happen. Everything that happens because of God. And therefore, if you were born under a bad constellation, under the influence of a bad constellation, mazal means constellation, we know that, well, you're in for trouble. But that's what prayer is for. Anyone who has troubles in his life, of course, should turn to God and pray that the evil decree be rescinded. Someone who is sick, a pathogen, a microorganism has invaded the body. Someone who is sick and serious disease. Well, of course, diseases are all facts of nature. It's blood levels of this and it's microorganisms of that. It's all facts of nature. But where did these facts of nature come from that made you sick? It all comes from God, and therefore, if you are sick because your body has been compromised by some pathogens, pray to God that God should reverse the evil influence of the bacteria that you swallowed. Pray to God that your blood levels of this or that should be restored to normal. God created the laws of nature which made you sick, and God, of course, has control over reversing that process, and therefore, what you want to do is pray to God to reverse the natural process that made you sick. Similarly, if the stars are such that you're going to have a bad influence from the stars, that's a fact of nature, a fact of nature created by God. God has the ability to reverse that procedure, and therefore you can pray to God to reverse the bad influence of whatever stars you were born under. Hakol biyado, everything is in the hands of God. La'asot l'shanot kechafzo, everything is in the hands of God to change as He wishes, and therefore it always makes sense to pray. Now, of course, he doesn't mean that if has v'shalom, if heaven forbid, you have a devastating disease because you have been smoking cigarettes all your life, it doesn't mean to pray to God to somehow erase and reverse the smoking of the cigarettes. The fact that you smoke the cigarettes is a simple fact, and a simple fact cannot be changed. But not every cigarette smoker ends up with emphysema. Not every cigarette smoker ends up with malignant growths in the lungs. Not the laws of nature which lead from cigarette smoking to emphysema, or from cigarette smoking to malignancies of the lungs. These are laws of nature which are reversible, and it's all in the hands of God, and therefore prayer is, of course, in order. Prayer is the order of the day. Let me point out in passing what should be obvious to you. He nowhere hints that there's something wrong with going to a physician as well and being treated according to the laws of nature. There are plenty of sources out there, not this one on the screen. There are plenty of other sources out there which would tell you what you have to do is pray to God and only pray to God, not turn to the physician for treatment. There are plenty of sources out there which deny the validity, which deny, not the validity of medicine. Medicine works, but there are plenty of sources out there which say Jews should not consult physicians. What Jews are supposed to do is pray to God. God is the Rofei, Kol Basar. God is the healer of all flesh, and therefore one should not turn to the physician. There are plenty of sources that say that, but not our Nimuki Yosef on the screen. He omits any hint to opposition to medical science. He says, in addition to medical science, one should also pray. Mihu, however, Razal, however, the rabbis, and he means specifically the rabbis of the Gemara, the rabbis of the Mishnah and Gemara, his Hiru warned us, and remember that in Rabbinic Hebrew, the word warn is identical with the word prohibit. However, the rabbis of the Mishnah and Gemara, the Talmudic rabbis, warned us or prohibited us So the word means both equally. Leval yasim adam machshavto be'elu hadvarim. The rabbis warned us or prohibited us from focusing our thoughts on these matters, on the matters of astrology. We're not supposed to get involved with astrology. We're not supposed to be concerned with it. We're not supposed to focus our attention on it. Instead, what you're supposed to do, instead of looking to astrologers for a solution to your problem, and they might really have solutions to your problem, instead, what you're supposed to do is depend upon God, God who created the universe, God who created the rules of astrology, God who created nature. What you're supposed to do is be tamim, pure in your heart, in depending upon God, even though the astrology might have some basis to it, indeed, even though it might work. That's not what Jews are supposed to do. Jews are supposed to depend on God. God, in His mercy, will save you if you deserve saving. And of course, if you don't deserve saving, the astrologers are not going to help you either. How do I know, our author asks, that it's wrong to approach the astrologers, even though much of what they say is true and valid, just like I know that pork really is food and really is nourishing, but we're prohibited from eating it. How do I know that we're not supposed to approach and consult with astrologers? How do I know that, he asks? Talmud Lomar, it says in a verse, there's a verse in the Torah. The verse in the Torah says, Tamim tihiyeh im Hashem Elokecha. The verse in the Torah says, you must be pure of heart with God. What does it mean? You must be pure of heart. The intentions of your heart must be focused entirely upon God for salvation and not on external factors. You have to concentrate on God as being the creator and controller of the world and not the astrologers. It's a verse in the Torah, Tamim tihiyeh im Hashem Elokecha. Now this verse, Tamim tihiyeh im Hashem Elokecha, you must be pure of heart with God, and that means excluding from your heart any consultation with astrologers. This verse was recently used as the title of a book that was recently published here in Yerushalayim. The book was written by Rav Hillel. Rav Hillel's well-known rabbi here in Yerushalayim. He is one of the leading Kabbalists in the world today. He is Rosh Yeshiva of Ahavat Shalom. Ahavat Shalom is a big yeshiva here in Yerushalayim. It's a big yeshiva which is devoted entirely to Kabbalistic studies. And the head, the dean of that academy, the Rosh Yeshiva, the head of Ahavat Shalom, is Rav Hillel, one of the great Kabbalists of modern times. He recently published a book, a lovely book, which has even been translated into English. Recently he published a book entitled Tamim Tihiyeh, you must be pure of heart with God. And in this book, the great Kabbalist himself, Rabbi Hillel, has chapter after chapter after chapter of everything which has to do with Kabbalah, everything which has to do with Jewish mysticism. One of the chapters deals with astrology, but he has chapters dealing with everything else which the Kabbalists are interested in, everything from amulets to incantations. He's got a chapter on everything imaginable in Kabbalistic thought, and he returns to the theme over and over again that even though it is true that amulets, if properly written, have power to heal, even though it's true that amulets, if properly prepared, have the power to influence your life, we are simply prohibited from taking that path. The Torah demands, Tamim tiyeh im Hashem. It's correct to study amulets because there's a lot of truth in the way they work. It's correct to study astrology because there's a lot of truth in astrology, and it's therefore valid and valuable to study the truth which is inherent in astrology. It is correct to study palm reading because there's a lot of truth in the way palm reading works. All of these mystical aspects have a lot of truth to them, and therefore it's indeed worthy of study. And he himself is the Rosh Yeshiva of the largest Kabbalistic yeshiva in the world. It's a large yeshiva here in Yerushalayim. But all that has to do with studying the truth which is in astrology, actually utilizing it in order to predict the future, actually writing an amulet in order to protect yourself against evil eye or whatever it is you want the amulet for, actually writing the amulet, actually using the amulet. Of course we don't do that. Of course it's hands off. Of course what Torah demands is that one be pure of heart with God and not actually use amulets, not actually use astrology, despite the truth which is in it. Now, the Nimuki Yosef is speaking about exactly this kind of pious rabbi, the kind of pious rabbi who rejects out of hand the Rambam's rejection of astrology, the kind of pious rabbi who embraces the truth of astrology, but nonetheless would never dream of actually using astrology. And the reason why we would not actually use astrology is because Torah demands purity of heart with God. We're not allowed to actually use the mystical truths which God implanted into the universe when he created the universe. These are things we study, but don't actually use. Let's go one step further. Back in the Middle Ages, this topic, the Rambam's rejection of astrology and the embracing of astrology on the part of other rabbis, this whole discussion was part of a larger issue. Back in the Middle Ages, well, to this very day, it's not limited to the Middle Ages, there was and still is a big divide between the mystics on the one hand and the rationalists on the other hand. Statistically speaking, the mystics are in the majority, but the fact that the mystics are in a statistical majority never impressed the rationalists very much. The rationalists still reject the mystical doctrines. The underlying disagreement, which began in antiquity and continues to this very day, the underlying problem is as follows. The rationalists believe in the power of the human mind to grasp truth. The human mind was created by God in a way that the human mind can grasp and understand truth. For example, the rationalist will say that things in the world around us are more or less the way they seem to be. I mean, there is such a thing as an optical illusion. Sometimes things are not at all what they seem to be. But in general, things are exactly what they seem to be. If something looks like a book with a red cover on it, that's what it is. It's a real book with a red cover on it. That's real. That's truth. You look at it, you feel it, and your mind tells you it's real, and it is real. It's possible to be deceived. There is such a thing as optical illusion. We have to be careful about that. But in general, truth is available to the human mind by simply observing the universe around us. This is the fundamental idea which the rationalists in the Middle Ages embraced, well, not only the Middle Ages, to this very day. On the other hand, there are mystics who are very suspicious of the power of the human mind, mystics who did not think that the human mind really is so powerful, mystics who don't think that the human mind, the human reason, is capable of grasping the ultimate truth of reality. According to the mystics, the only way to know reality, the only way to know truth, is not by applying your reason, but by experiencing it. What you experience is true and valid. What you know in your mind could very well be self-deception. And therefore, where there is a conflict between what your mind tells you must be true and what you experience, where there's a conflict between them, the rationalists will, of course, give preference to what their reason tells them is true. The mystics will give preference to what their experience tells them is true. Now, if you think about it for a moment, you will realize that mystics who depend largely on experience to tell them what is true, human experience, is something which is often very difficult to convey in words. Words don't often get it. Words are great. Language is great for expressing the thoughts of reason. The product of the human mind can be expressed in words very nicely. Language does wonderful, works wonderfully for expressing the product of human reason. On the other hand, mysticism, the experiences, the mystical experience is such that human language fails us, and we're unable in words to express what happened. Let me just give you a silly example for you to understand what I'm talking about, and then we'll see better examples, deeper, more profound examples. Here's the silly example. Imagine for a moment, I don't know all of the participants, but imagine for a moment that you have experienced drunkenness. You've been drunk once in your life. It could be, I don't know you very well, but imagine someone who has experienced drunkenness once in his life. Surely we cannot say once in her life, because women, of course, never consume alcohol. Everyone knows that. Now, someone who's experienced drunkenness in the past can read a book, a story written by some author, doesn't matter who, and the author says that the character in the book drank a lot of whiskey and then walked dizzily to the door. Now, someone who has never experienced drunkenness has no way of knowing what the author meant when the author wrote that this drunken person walked dizzily to the door. On the other hand, anyone who has experienced drunkenness knows exactly what the author means when he says that the drunken person walked dizzily to the door. It's only someone who has had the experience knows what you are talking about. Human language fails us in trying to convey exactly what drunkenness feels like. If you have never tasted chocolate, there is no way that human language can explain to you what the taste of chocolate is. On the other hand, anyone who has tasted chocolate knows exactly what I mean. If I say such and such tastes like chocolate, well, since human language fails us in expressing mystical realities of experience, it follows, therefore, that mystical literature relies very heavily on simile and metaphor. Simile and metaphor means this is like that. This is similar to that. Think about it for a moment. The opening chapter of Sefer Yecheskel, the opening chapter of the book of Ezekiel in the Torah, is a mystical vision. The prophet Yecheskel has a mystical vision of the throne of glory. And if you read the first chapter, it's not many verses. It's one page of text. In that one page of text, in the first chapter of the book of Yecheskel, where the prophet is trying to tell us about his mystical experience, he's unable to find the words to tell us exactly what it is he saw in his mystical vision. He's unable to find the words to tell us exactly what he experienced. The word kamo in Hebrew, like, appears many, many times. In the first chapter of Ezekiel, he says, what I experienced was like this, it was similar to that, it was like something else, it was similar to something else. He can't tell us exactly what it is because it was a mystical experience, and therefore the best he can do is offer simile and metaphor, some kind of comparisons. Anyone else who has had that mystical experience will know exactly what he's talking about. Anyone who has not had the mystical experience has no way of perceiving what it is he's referring to. Not only are simile and metaphor basic modes of expression in mystical literature, but poetry is also terribly important. After all, much of what poetry is about is to convey a feeling, to convey an idea above and beyond what the words are able to say. That's largely what poetry is about, and therefore mystics rely heavily not only on simile and metaphor, but on poetic expression. Rationalists, on the other hand, are not happy with poetry at all. The Rambam couldn't stand poetry. The Rambam said, Meitav hashira hasheker, if the poem is any good, it's a lie. After all, if what you want to tell me is a simple truth, tell me in prose. The very fact that you had to turn to poetry to tell me what you're saying means there's something not true in what you're trying to express. The rationalists didn't like poetry at all. Poetry is embraced by the mystics. Now, this controversy between the mystics and the rationalists is a huge one, and it's been going on for an awful long time. And in the Middle Ages, back in the days of the Rambam, in the century after the Rambam, the rabbis were fighting over this issue very intensely, and they continue to fight to this very day. Many rabbis insisted, many mystical rabbis, many rabbis who are on the mystical side of the divide, insisted that their disciples not read anything written by Rambam or any of the rationalists. The mystical rabbis said, and they were the majority, they still are the majority today, the mystical rabbis said the rationalists are wrong, and therefore we want nothing to do with their literature. We don't want their sfarim, we don't want to have anything to do with them, and they were excluded from the Beis Midrash, excluded from the study halls of the mystical rabbis. The Rashba that we're about to look at, the text we're about to look at, was the greatest of the rabbis in Spain in the 14th century. He was the greatest of the rabbis in Spain, and from all over the world, the rabbis turned to him for a resolution of this issue. The mystical rabbis said to him, should we embrace the Mishneh Torah and the other writings of the Rambam, even though we totally reject his rationalism, or should we hold fast and reject all his writings because of the rationalist orientation there? They turned to the Rashba for advice. Let's see what the Rashba had to say about this issue. These are the Rashba's words. Masha noagim she'ein nosim nashim ad milui halavan be'elo aratzot. The practice in these countries, and he means Europe, because that's where he lived in the 14th century, the practice in these countries not to get married during the part of the month when the moon is declining. In the Jewish month, in the lunar month, the new moon appears at the beginning of the month. The moon grows until you get to the 15th day of the Jewish month, the 15th day of the lunar month. And in the second half of the lunar month, the moon gets smaller until it disappears. That's the cycle of the moon. And the Jewish months are lunar months. That's the way it works. Well, they were getting married. They were getting married during the first half of the month because they wanted the influence of the moon to shine upon the marriage. When the moon was growing, that is auspicious, and therefore one wants to get married during one of the days of the month when the moon is growing in strength, growing in size, in order to receive the auspicious, the good influence of the moon upon the marriage. And in point of fact, all the marriages were scheduled in the first half of the Jewish month, the first half of the lunar month, not the second half. Well, that was a simple fact. That's when the weddings were scheduled. And the Rashba says, Eino nichush. This is not some magical decision. If the decision to get married in the first part of the month were indeed based on magic, of course we would say it's usher. Of course we would say it's prohibited to schedule your magic. Of course we would say it's prohibited to schedule your marriage based on some magical wisdom. Torah surely prohibits that. And if that's what the marriage scheduling of the marriage had to do with, we would of course be unhappy with it. But this is nothing magical. Nothing magical in scheduling marriages for the first part of the month. Ella, rather, kishem shemoshchim malachim al ha'ma'ayan v'timshach malchuto. Just as in the Bible, it's perfectly clear that new kings, right, when the king is anointed, king has to be anointed. There's some oil has to be placed on his head. That was part of the ritual of appointing a new king. Right? Oil was put on the head, anointing the new king. Now, where did they do this? The anointing of the new kings, and there are plenty of examples of the biblical kings who were anointed. They were not anointed in their living rooms. They were not anointed in the temple. They were anointed at a spring. The new king and his family and his retinue would go out to a spring, a bubbling spring with his water bubbling out all the time. There's the natural spring, and next to the spring is where the king would be anointed. Why? To say, just as the spring is constantly producing water and will never fail us, so the new kingdom, the new king sitting on the throne should constantly, without any interruption, have power over the people and bring good things to the people, just like the spring is constantly, without interruption, bringing water to the people. Now, why did they do that? Why did they do that? There's some kind of siman, some kind of reason why the biblical kings all went to the spring for their anointment. And a similar idea underlies scheduling weddings in the first half of the month. And the underlying idea is as follows. Simana Tavahu. It's a good siman. Anointing a king by the spring or scheduling your wedding for the first half of the month is a simana tova, a good siman, a good sign. Similarly, at the wedding festival, they pour wine out in front of the chatan, in front of the groom. Why do they pour wine out in front of the groom, in front of the chatan at the wedding ceremonies? It's also a simana tova, a good sign. Ein bo mishum darchei ha'amori. This is no superstitious imitation of Gentile ways. There's nothing magical about it. It's only a simin tov. Now the Rashba has introduced an idea which, if it works out, is going to go far to resolving all of our problems. We've not yet explained how the idea works. We've not yet explained exactly the mechanics of the idea, but the idea is some things are magical and are indeed prohibited. Other things are only a simin tov, a good sign, and there's no objection to that. Now we have to understand a little bit what this good sign is and what the difference is between it and prohibited magic. In the Gemara in Shabbos, Mashma, in Tractate Shabbat, it implies Mutar l'shmoa le'itstagninin laha'amin le'divrehem me'Avram sha'amar. The Gemara talks about Avraham Avinu, our great patriarch, who said, Mistakalti b'istagninus. Avraham, our father, looked up to the stars in order to decide what to do or what not to do, implying that there's no objection to doing that, or else Avraham, our father, would not have done it. He was the progenitor of our people, and he did it. Rabbi Akiva, remember the story of Rabbi Akiva? We saw it last week. Rabbi Akiva was worried about what the astrologers told him. Remember last week, the astrologers told Rabbi Akiva that his daughter would die from a snake bite on the day of her wedding, and that bothered Rabbi Akiva a lot. He was very perturbed by that. Rabbi Akiva himself accepted the validity of astrology. Avram Avinu accepted astrology. Rabbi Akiva accepted astrology. After Rabbi Akiva's daughter was saved, you remember, she stuck the pin into the wall, the hairpin. She stuck into the wall and killed the snake before the snake could kill her. Darash, Rabbi Akiva went out and made a sermon, Staka Tatzil Mamavis Mamish. The reason she was saved, Rabbi Akiva figured out, is because, you remember, she did a great act of charity in giving her dinner to a poor person who knocked at the door. So Rabbi Akiva figured out from this that the performance of mitzvahs can save you from the nefarious influence of the stars. But if the stars have a bad influence, he agreed, Jews have a way to escape the bad influence of the stars through performance of Torah and mitzvahs. Our author goes on and says, sometimes God performs a miracle for those who fear him. Sometimes God performs a miracle on behalf of those who fear him, and God will cancel the nefarious influence, the bad influence of the stars. That's what happened with Rabbi Akiva's daughter. She did a great mitzvah, which found favor in God's eyes. She did a great act of charity for the poor person who knocked on the door, and God canceled the evil influence of the stars, which would have killed her, and she survived. These are hidden miracles, hidden in the sense that we don't actually see the miracle working, unlike the crossing of the Red Sea, where everyone saw that the water separated. These miracles, the saving of Rabbi Akiva's daughter, that her life was saved, it's not obviously a miracle, because people didn't realize she was destined for death in the first place, and therefore the miraculous nature of her salvation was not apparent to everyone. It's a hidden miracle. These hidden miracles, which occur all of the time, are part of the workings of the universe. she did an act of charity in the merit of which she was saved. Lefichach ein shoalim behem, and therefore we do not approach the astrologers. Instead, we approach God with prayer, Torah, and mitzvahs, and depend upon God to save us. Does astrology work? Yes. Do we use it? No. Okay, we're beginning to finalize, we're beginning to crystallize the Rashba's approach. With this, we come to the end of our hour. Next week, in Yirtzeh Hashem, we will finalize and crystallize the Rashba's approach, and then we'll see the approaches of other rabbis to these issues. Until then, I wish you a Shabbat Shalom, a good week, and look forward to seeing you again a week from tonight. Until then, Shalom, Shalom.